Rachel Maddow just uncovered a massive Trump scandal that nobody noticed, and this is much larger news than you would initially think, so make sure you stick to the end to hear all of it.
But it was only about 6 months ago that Donald Trump announced who he was going to run with for this past election. It was about 6 months ago that we got J.D. Vance announced as Trump's vice presidential running mate. His record as a public official, or even just his record kind of as an adult, was hard to explain. For most of his adult life, he had been basically a protege, realistically more like an intern, for years and years and years, for one very eccentric, very right-wing, German-born tech billionaire. That particular eccentric billionaire had basically adopted J.D. Vance, had set him up in a whole series of jobs, none of which he had very much success at. But then the billionaire decided that the next job he wanted to put J.D. Vance into was the United States Senate. And so he essentially bought a Senate campaign for him. He made the largest single political donation ever made to a U.S. Senate candidate in American history. And he effectively ran his campaign. And that is how J.D. Vance was effectively given the only job he ever had in politics before he then immediately became vice president of the United States. And, you know, at that point, when he was chosen to be Trump's running mate, you could basically not see him for all the red flags around him. You couldn't make him out amid all the red flags. I mean, the billionaire who gave him all of his jobs and installed him in the U.S. Senate, and who then reportedly told Trump to put him on the ticket with him as his vice presidential running mate, that billionaire himself is on the record saying he does not believe in democracy. He does not believe that women should have the right to vote in America. He once spent a small chunk of his huge fortune trying to get people to move onto floating sea colonies made from shipping containers, because that would be a better way to live than living in countries, because countries are so terrible and so is democracy, right? So that's the political project of the guy whose other political project was putting J.D. Vance in at the top of the U.S. government. So red flag. Right? This is how the guy talks. This is how he was auditioning to be chosen as Trump's vice president.
Almost the thing that you need to do, step one in the process, is to totally replace, like rip out like a tumor, the current American leadership class, and then reinstall some sense of American, political religion.
Rip it out like a tumor. Rip it out like a tumor, he said. Whatever it is we've had in this country, rip it out like a tumor. So this is very bad news, right? When J.D. Vance would do podcast interviews and talk about how the government should, conservatives should see the government and government should seize the endowments of private universities, with conservatives in control, they should find ways to hurt even private companies that don't support the leader. He said we should rip out the current class of Americans like they're a tumor. Right? When he talked about all these things in these very radical right podcasts, he'd get his interlocutors very excited, these guys who he was talking to. And very frequently, they'd want to know more. They'd try to get him to talk about where it was that he got all these great ideas.
How do we, aside from elections, how do we rip out this leadership class? So these institutions are corrupted and rotted to the core. This elite ideology is everywhere and in all the things. What other options do we have besides voting them out, which we're seeing is ineffectual?
Yeah, so again, this is like a tough question, but this is maybe the question that confronts us right now, right? So there's this guy, Curtis Yarvin, who's written about some of these things.
There's this guy, Curtis Yarvin, who's written about some of these things. Donald Trump had to get rid of his first-term vice president because his first-term vice president wouldn't help with his effort to overthrow the government and stay in power despite losing an election. And so Trump sicked a violent, angry mob on Capitol Hill, and that angry mob then proceeded to try to hunt down Trump's vice president, screaming that they wanted to kill him, hang Mike Pence. So that didn't go great. He needed a new guy. For the new guy, he picked this rando who had only been in the Senate about 5 minutes, who nobody in the country had really heard of, who had no political skills to speak of, who was deeply unpopular from the first moment he was named, but he was really, 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 really linked in to an eccentric, very far-right tech billionaire political faction. And the political guru of that political faction, the guy who inspires all of their political goals, is this one guy.
You know, there's this guy, Curtis Yarvin, who's written about some of these things.
Knowing chuckle from the podcast interviewer. Oh, yeah, Curtis Yarvin. This guy, Curtis Yarvin, that's who J.D. Vance cites as the guy who's been doing the big thinking about this stuff. You tell me if that explains what we are living through right now, today, in the news, because here is Curtis Yarvin.
Why has no one ever suggested, let's just get rid of this thing? You have a government in Washington. You're either for it or against it. What is a government? A government is just a corporation which owns a country. Nothing more, nothing less. It so happens that our sovereign corporation is very poorly managed. And there's a very simple way to replace that, which is what we do to all corporations that have failed. We simply delete them. We haven't been able to do that with our government for 200 years. So it's gotten a little bit stale. The other thing about getting rid of your government is you can't just say, well, the limits of the government are the limits of the formal government. You have to say, well, what is the system actually? And it includes a lot of things that are called NGOs, things that are called universities, things that are funded by the state. It's a very, very large system, and it all needs to be destroyed.
NGOs, universities, things that are funded by the state. It's a large system, and it all needs to be destroyed. Because we need to, in his words, delete the government, delete the whole system, including nonprofits, including universities, including everything the government funds. We need to destroy all of it. And why would you do that? What would you want to replace it with?
You need a CEO, and a national CEO is what's called a dictator. It's the same thing. There's no difference between a CEO and a dictator. If Americans want to change their government, they're going to have to get over their dictator phobia.
Americans are going to have to get over their dictator phobia. We need to delete the government, destroy all nonprofits and schools, and get rid of everything the government funds. We need to bring it all down to zero. We need to destroy the whole system. And the reason we need to do that is so we can have a national CEO take over and run everything. And what is a national CEO? A national CEO is a dictator. Just run that definition one more time.
You need a CEO, and a national CEO is what's called a dictator. It's the same thing. There's no difference between a CEO and a dictator. If Americans want to change their government, they're going to have to get over their dictator phobia.
Americans need to get over their dictator phobia. This is the philosopher, right, of this milieu from which we got J.D. Vance. This is the philosophy that drives the eccentric right-wing tech billionaire class that has ascended, that is effectively the defining feature and driving force of Trump's second term. That is where they got J.D. Vance from. Quote, Vance is friends with Curtis Yarvin, whom he openly cites as a political influence. And this isn't like a Rosetta Stone, you know, it's not that complex. But they really did tell us in advance what they were going to do, and now they are doing it. And I think the biggest barrier to getting Americans to understand that during the election campaign was because it was so crazy you couldn't believe they were really going to do it, right? But now they're doing it. Because in order to delete the government, to destroy the whole American government and the American system and rip it out like a tumor, so instead we can get over our dictator phobia and at last have a national CEO. We can at last have a dictator. What do we have to do to get there? What's the operational day one plan to get there? What should we see these guys try to do if in fact they get that power that J.D. Vance says they need to wield more ruthlessly?
So I've reduced this very complicated problem to a simple 4-letter acronym, which is RAGE. And RAGE stands for Retire All Government Employees. Very, very, very simple. Now, the problem with this is, why have you never heard this before?
Retire all government employees. It's interesting. He doesn't say fire them. He says retire them, both because RAGE is a better acronym than phage. But he also is suggesting giving them all payouts, giving government employees generous payments so they will all leave the government, so the government can be closed, can be deleted, can be collapsed, so that we can have a national CEO, so we can have a dictator instead. It's a pretty out there idea, right? Pretty wild, pretty far out there, as J.D. Vance might say. But here's what it looks like tonight in the flesh, because they're actually trying to do it. Tonight, a buyout program for every worker in the U.S. federal government. Quote, if you choose to remain in your current position, we cannot give you full assurance regarding the certainty of your position or agency, but should your position be eliminated, you will be treated with dignity. If you choose not to continue in your current role in the federal workforce, we thank you for your service to your country, and you will be provided with a dignified, fair departure from the federal government. This program begins effective January 28th, meaning today, and is available to all federal employees until February 6th, next Thursday. Quote, if you resign under this program, you will retain all pay and benefits regardless of your daily workload until September 30th, 2025, or earlier if you choose to accelerate your resignation.
So this is what the secret plan has been all along, and we've all been so busy watching all of the terrible things that Trump has been doing that J.D. Vance and his scheme completely slipped our mind. This is terrible news for our democracy, and it proves that the fight is just getting started.